They say the walls of Sant'Anna Sanitarium breathe, that they've absorbed the screams of the patients who vanished within, and that even decades later, those screams still echo. I didn't believe it, not at first. But now, as I sit here, haunted by whispers that follow me even in silence, I realize some places never let you leave. The first time I heard about Sant'Anna Sanitarium, I dismissed it as just another urban legend, a cautionary tale whispered by locals to keep curious wanderers at bay. But Renata, our team's history enthusiast, had a way of pulling threads until they unraveled into stories too intriguing to ignore. When she found a mention of the sanatorium in a crumbling, handwritten journal at an antique shop, it became impossible to resist. "We have to document this," she had said, her eyes gleaming with excitement. "The place is practically begging for a deep dive." So here we were, 5 aspiring filmmakers, packed into a dusty old van, bumping along the uneven road that snaked through the dense forest. The van carried more than our gear. It held our collective ambitions and a shared determination to make something extraordinary. I glanced at my team. Mateus sat in the passenger seat, arms crossed, his skepticism practically radiating from him. "You do realize these stories are just that? Stories?" he said, addressing no one in particular. Behind him, Pedro was fiddling with a microphone, muttering about interference. Sophia, our youngest member, leaned her head against the window, wide-eyed as we approached our destination. And Renata? She was glued to her notebook, piecing together fragmented accounts of patients who'd vanished without a trace. When the forest thinned and the sanatorium came into view, a chill swept through the van. The building stood as a hollowed-out husk of its former self, its crumbling facade veined with ivy. Broken windows reflected the dying light of the day, and the air seemed unnaturally still. "Welcome to Sant'Anna," I said, forcing a smile that no one returned. We parked just outside the rusted gates. A sign hung crookedly, its faded letters barely legible. "Enter at your own risk." The first thing I noticed as we stepped out was the silence. It wasn't the comforting quiet of nature, but a heavy, oppressive stillness that seemed to press against my ears. "I'm getting weird readings," Pedro said, glancing at his sound recorder. "Like footsteps, but faint." Renata was already moving toward the gates, her camera in hand. "This is perfect," she said, her voice tinged with awe. "Exactly the atmosphere we need." I hesitated, looking at the others. Mateus shrugged, Sophia shivered, and Pedro adjusted his headphones. There was no turning back now. As we crossed the threshold into the grounds, the temperature seemed to drop. Gravel crunched under our boots, and I swore I saw movement in one of the upper windows, though it was probably just a bird or a trick of the light. "Let's set up near the main entrance," I said, trying to sound confident. "We'll do some exterior shots before it gets too dark." But as I walked toward the imposing front doors, a nagging unease settled in my chest. The stories Renata had unearthed were beginning to feel less like folklore and more like warnings we had chosen to ignore. The air inside Sant'Anna was colder than I expected, a sharp contrast to the lingering warmth of the day. As we stepped through the gaping front doors, a draft hit us, carrying the scent of mildew and decay. The once grand entrance hall stretched before us, its marble floors cracked and littered with debris. Above, an ornate chandelier hung precariously, its crystals dulled by decades of dust. "This place is a gold mine for atmosphere," Renata murmured, adjusting her camera for a wide shot. Her voice echoed faintly, as though the building itself were listening. Pedro stayed close to her, his microphone held high. "This silence is unnatural," he said. "It's not just quiet. It's like something is absorbing the sound." Mateus snorted. "It's called abandonment. Places like this aren't spooky. They're just depressing." "Keep telling yourself that," I muttered, my eyes scanning the hall. Sophia trailed behind, her flashlight darting across peeling wallpaper and warped furniture. "What's in there?" she asked, pointing to a corridor that branched off to the right. "We'll get to it," I said, trying to keep the group focused. "Let's cover the main hall first." Despite my attempt at control, my heart was pounding. Every creak of the old building felt deliberate, as if it were reacting to our presence. As we filmed, Renata paused near a toppled filing cabinet. "These might be patient records," she said, crouching down. Her fingers traced the edges of faded folders, pulling one free. "Look at this, a therapy transcript." The yellowed pages detailed a session between a doctor and a patient named Clara. Her words were scrawled in uneven handwriting. "He's watching me through the walls. Even when I close my eyes, I can feel him there." Renata read the passage aloud, her voice trembling slightly. "Well, that's comforting," Matthias said with a dry chuckle. "It's fascinating," Renata insisted. "This kind of paranoia, it could be tied to the doctor's methods. Imagine what we could uncover here." "Let's not imagine too hard," Pedro muttered, adjusting his headset. "I'm picking up faint sounds again, like footsteps, but they're irregular. It's probably just the building settling, but it's strange." Sophia glanced nervously at the corridor again. "Can we move? This spot feels wrong." I nodded, leading the group deeper into the hall. The further we went, the more oppressive the air became. It was as though the sanatorium was alive, its decaying walls closing in around us. At the end of the hall, a heavy wooden door hung partially ajar. Renata pushed it open, revealing a large room filled with decaying hospital beds. Some were still upright, while others lay overturned, their metal frames rusted and bent. "This must have been a common ward," she said, her camera sweeping the room. "Imagine the stories these walls could tell." As if on cue, a faint sound echoed, soft, like a whisper carried by the wind. Did anyone else hear that? Pedro froze, his hand gripping the microphone. "It's just the wind," Matthias said, though his voice lacked conviction. The whisper came again, slightly louder this time, and distinctly not the wind. "Okay, maybe it's time to regroup," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We'll head back to the main hall and plan our next steps." But as we turned to leave, the door we'd entered slammed shut with a deafening bang. Sophia screamed, and even Matthias jumped. "Who the hell did that?" he demanded, but we all knew no one had been near the door. Pedro pointed to his recorder. "The footsteps I mentioned earlier, they're getting louder." The oppressive silence had given way to something worse, a growing sense that we were not alone. My breathing felt heavier as we stood in the ward, staring at the door that had slammed shut. I tried to mask my fear with authority, but the panic in Sophia's wide eyes mirrored what I felt inside. "Let's not lose focus," I said, though my voice wavered. "This building is old. It could have been the wind or structural shifts." Pedro tilted his head, listening through his headphones. "Structural shifts don't have patterns," he muttered. "These footsteps, they're deliberate. Slow, like someone's pacing just a few feet ahead of us." "We're wasting time," Renata said, snapping out of her daze. "Whatever that was, we have to document it. This is exactly what makes a project like ours stand out." Matthias groaned. "Sure, let's document the creepy noises and die famous." Ignoring him, Renata led the way back to the main hall. The corridor felt tighter now, the shadows heavier. My flashlight flickered, its beam weak against the suffocating darkness. "Does anyone else feel like the air is thicker?" Sophia asked, clutching her flashlight as if it were a lifeline. Before I could answer, Renata stopped abruptly. "Look," she said, pointing to a room just off the corridor. The plaque on the door read, "Archives." "This is it," she said, her voice almost reverent. "The heart of the sanatorium's history." The door creaked open, revealing rows of rusted filing cabinets and shelves stacked with crumbling folders. Dust particles swirled in the light of our flashlights, creating an eerie glow. Renata immediately began sifting through the documents. "These are patient records," she whispered, pulling a file from the shelf. "Look at this one. Clara Santos. She's mentioned in that transcript we found earlier." As Renata read aloud, I felt the hairs on my neck stand on end. "The walls are alive. They breathe when I sleep. He comes at night and takes the others away." Pedro adjusted his microphone. "Stop reading for a second," he said, his brow furrowed. "There's something under your voice. Play it back." He rewound the recorder and hit play. Renata's voice echoed back, but layered beneath it was a faint, distorted whisper. Stay. You're one of us now. The silence that followed was deafening. Is this a joke? Mateus asked, though his voice betrayed his unease. No one's joking, Pedro said, staring at the recorder. This isn't interference. As we processed what we'd just heard, the temperature in the room dropped sharply. My breath formed visible puffs, and Sophia clung to my arm. I want to leave, she whispered. Before I could respond, Renata pulled out another file. Her hands trembled as she opened it. This isn't just patient records, she said. There's something about experiments. The file detailed a series of tests conducted by Dr. Augusto, the sanatorium's lead physician. His notes described attempts to manipulate the minds of patients, exposing them to extreme fear to transcend their physical limitations. This man was insane, Renata said, her voice shaky. The whispering returned, louder this time, and unmistakably coming from the walls. Words overlapped in an incomprehensible cacophony, but one phrase stood out, clear and sharp. Leave now! Done, Mateus said, already moving toward the door. But before any of us could follow, the door slammed shut again. The room plunged into near darkness as Sophia's flashlight died. Try to open it, I shouted, my voice shaking. Mateus pulled at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It's stuck, he said, panic creeping into his tone. Renata shined her flashlight toward the far end of the room. There's another door, she said, though her voice carried little hope. We moved as one toward the back of the archives, the whispering growing louder with every step. The room seemed to stretch endlessly, as though the walls were expanding. Pedro suddenly stopped, gripping my arm. Do you see that? He whispered. I followed his gaze and froze. In the far corner of the room, just beyond the reach of our flashlights, a figure stood perfectly still. It was tall, its features obscured by shadows, but its presence was undeniable. It didn't move. Neither did we. What is that? Sophia whimpered. No one answered. The whispers became deafening, like 100 voices all screaming at once. The figure took a single step forward. Run! I yelled, dragging Sophia toward the back door. Renata pushed it open, and we stumbled into another corridor, gasping for air. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so profound it was almost worse. Okay, I said, my voice shaking. We need a new plan. The corridor we stumbled into was narrower than the others, its walls lined with peeling tiles that shimmered under the weak beams of our flashlights. A putrid smell lingered in the air, as if something had rotted and been left to fester for years. Where are we now? Mateus asked, his voice low but sharp. Renata shined her flashlight down the hall, revealing an old metal door at the far end. Above it, faded letters spelled restricted access. This has to be where the experiments happened, she said. Her earlier excitement dimmed, but not gone. Sophia clung to my arm, trembling. Can't we just go back the way we came? Pedro shook his head, glancing over his shoulder. That door isn't opening anytime soon. This is our only option. Reluctantly, we moved forward. The sound of our footsteps echoed off the walls, but there was something else. A faint rhythmic tapping, as though someone, or something, was waiting for us on the other side. When we reached the door, Renata hesitated for the first time. She ran her fingers over the rusted surface, then pushed it open with a groan of protesting hinges. What lay beyond froze us in place. The room was cavernous, dimly lit by the flicker of an old bulb that hung from the ceiling. Rows of chairs encircled the space, each one bolted to the floor. Their leather straps were cracked and brittle, but their purpose was unmistakable. They were restraints. Is this a testing room? I asked, though the answer was obvious. Renata stepped forward, her camera whirring as she began filming. This matches the descriptions in the files. Patients were restrained here during whatever they were subjected to. Pedro pointed his microphone toward the center of the room, where an intricate circle had been burned into the floor. Symbols I couldn't recognize marked its edges, their shapes jagged and foreboding. What the hell is this? Matthias asked, stepping closer despite himself. Renata crouched near the circle, tracing one of the symbols with her finger. "It looks like some kind of ritual," she said. "Maybe a psychological experiment? Something meant to manipulate the mind through fear." "That's not psychology," Pedro said, his voice unnaturally calm. "That's something else." A metallic clang made us all jump. I spun around, shining my flashlight toward the sound, but the room was empty, save for us. "Did anyone see that?" Sophia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "No," I said, "and I don't think I want to." Renata ignored us, focused on the burned circle. "This might explain the whispers," she said almost to herself. "If the doctor was trying to connect patients to—" A loud, piercing shriek cut her off. It wasn't human. It was guttural and filled with rage. Sophia screamed, backing into me as Pedro pointed his microphone frantically around the room. "It's coming from everywhere," he said, his face pale. The flickering bulb above us shattered, plunging the room into darkness. "Flashlights!" I yelled, fumbling to turn mine back on. When the light returned, the room seemed smaller, the walls closer. The circle on the floor glowed faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. "We need to leave," Matthias said, his voice trembling. "No arguments here," I replied, grabbing Renata's arm. As we turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind us with a force that shook the walls. Something heavy moved in the shadows, a dragging sound, slow and deliberate. "Who's there?" I called, though I regretted it immediately. The only response was another shriek, this one closer. "Run!" Renata shouted, and we bolted for the far end of the room. A second door appeared, half hidden behind a pile of overturned chairs. Pedro and Matthias shoved it open, and we spilled into another corridor, gasping for breath. I glanced back just in time to see a shadowed figure standing at the edge of the circle, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. We didn't stop running until the corridor ended in a set of rusted stairs spiraling downward. I leaned against the wall, gasping for air. The others collapsed around me, their faces pale and eyes wide. "What the hell was that?" Sophia demanded, her voice trembling. "No idea," Matthias replied, pacing. "But whatever it is, it doesn't want us here." Renata clutched her camera like it was a lifeline. "It was standing in the circle," she said, almost in a daze. "It looked human, but it wasn't. It couldn't be." Pedro, always the skeptic, adjusted his microphone with shaking hands. "There's no explanation for what we just saw. None." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the faint hum of the building around us. "Guys," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "we need to keep moving. If we stay here, it's going to find us." The stairs groaned under our weight as we descended into the bowels of the sanatorium. The air grew colder, damp, and suffocating, and the faint smell of rot intensified. At the bottom, we found ourselves in a wide, open space that felt more like a dungeon than part of a hospital. Rows of steel tables lined the room, their surfaces stained with dark, unidentifiable streaks. Strange equipment sat abandoned, their purposes lost to time. "This is it," Renata whispered, filming everything in sight. "This is where the experiments really happened." Pedro's microphone picked up faint static, a sound he claimed was indicative of movement. "It's here again," he said, his voice flat with fear. Sophia pressed closer to me, her flashlight darting over the room. "I don't like this. Can we please just leave?" "We can't leave yet," Renata said firmly. "Not until we understand what's going on." Matthias scoffed. "Understand? You want to stick around and have a conversation with whatever's been stalking us?" Before anyone could respond, the static in Pedro's headphones grew louder. Then came the whispers, clearer this time, like voices just out of reach. "You don't belong here. Stay." The voice was layered, overlapping itself, as though multiple entities were speaking at once. "We need to leave," I said, my stomach churning with dread. "Now!" As I turned to lead the group back up the stairs, the heavy metal door slammed shut, trapping us in the room. "Damn it!" Matthias yelled, pounding on the door. Renata aimed her flashlight toward the center of the room, where something caught her eye. A figure was emerging from the shadows, its form flickering like static on an old TV. It was tall, unnaturally thin, and its face was wrong. The features seemed to shift, blurring and distorting as it moved closer. "Don't move," I whispered, though every instinct screamed for me to run. The figure stopped, its head tilting unnaturally as though studying us. Then it spoke. "You're part of the experiment now." The voice was cold and detached, but it carried a weight that seemed to crush the air out of my lungs. "No," Renata whispered, stepping back. "This isn't real." The figure raised an arm, pointing directly at her. Suddenly, the air was filled with the sound of screams, not ours, but distant, as though they were coming from the walls themselves. Renata dropped to her knees, clutching her head. "Stop it!" she cried. "Make it stop!" Pedro and I grabbed her, pulling her away as Mateus and Sofia frantically tried to force the door open. The whispers grew louder, overlapping with the screams until it became an unbearable cacophony. "Push harder!" I shouted at Mateus. Finally, the door gave way, and we stumbled out into another corridor. The silence that followed was almost as deafening as the noise had been. I turned to look back one last time, but the figure was gone. All that remained was the faint glow of the circle on the floor, pulsing like a dying heartbeat. "We can't stay here," I said, my voice firm despite the terror gnawing at me. "Whatever this is, it wants us broken. We need to get out before it succeeds." We moved quickly through the endless corridors, our footsteps echoing as if the building itself were mocking us. The air was thick with tension, each of us carrying the unspoken fear that the figure would return at any moment. "This place is a maze," Mateus muttered, glancing over his shoulder. "How do we even know we're going the right way?" "We don't," I admitted, my voice tight. "But standing still isn't an option." Pedro adjusted his microphone, his face pale and damp with sweat. "The whispers. They're still following us, getting closer." I didn't need his equipment to know he was right. The faint layered voices had returned, growing louder with every step. "Keep moving," I urged, gripping Sophia's hand to steady her trembling. Renata suddenly stopped, holding up her flashlight to illuminate a door ahead of us. Unlike the others, this one was reinforced with iron bars and had no handle. Above it, a single word was etched into the frame: redemption. "What is this?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Before I could respond, the whispers surged, accompanied by a low, guttural growl. The corridor grew colder, and a shadow stretched along the wall behind us, too large to belong to any of us. "It's here," Sophia whimpered. Pedro stepped forward, examining the door. "There's something on the other side," he said. "I can hear it. Something faint, like breathing." Mateus shook his head. "We are not going in there." "We might not have a choice," I said, turning to face the shadow that was creeping closer. The door creaked open, slowly, as if inviting us inside. The growl behind us deepened, and the temperature dropped so sharply that my breath fogged the air. Without a word, we stepped through the doorway. The room was small and barren, with a single object in its center. A wooden chest covered in deep scratches, its surface marked by the same symbols we'd seen in the circle earlier. "What's in it?" Renata asked, stepping closer. "I don't think we want to know," Mateus replied, his voice tight. Pedro knelt beside the chest, his hands hovering over the lid. "Whatever's in here, it's connected to all of this. If we destroy it—" A deafening roar cut him off, and the shadow entered the room, solidifying into the figure we'd seen before. Its distorted face seemed to twist with rage as it lunged toward us. "Do it!" I screamed at Pedro. Pedro nodded, throwing the lid open. Inside were the tapes, dozens of them, neatly stacked, their labels faded but legible. Session 1, Session 2. "These are the experiments," he said. "This is what's keeping it alive." The figure advanced, its arms outstretched as the whispers crescendoed into a deafening scream. Pedro grabbed the tapes, his eyes locking with mine. "Go. I'll hold it off." "No!" I shouted, but he was already moving. Pedro threw the tapes onto the floor, smashing them one by one under his boots. The figure howled in agony, its form flickering like a dying flame. "Get out of here!" Pedro yelled. Mateus grabbed my arm, pulling me toward another door that had appeared on the far side of the room. Sophia and Renata followed, their faces streaked with tears. The last thing I saw before we escaped was Pedro standing defiantly as the figure lunged at him. The door slammed shut behind us, cutting off the sound of the whispers and leaving us in silence. We emerged into the cold night air, gasping for breath. The sanatorium loomed behind us, its windows dark and lifeless once more. "Pedro," Sophia whispered, collapsing to her knees. I stared at the building, my chest tight with guilt and grief. "He saved us," I said, though the words felt hollow. Renata clutched her camera, her hands trembling. "We need to leave, now." Without another word, we stumbled toward the van, the oppressive weight of the sanatorium still pressing down on us. The drive back to the city was silent. The van felt emptier without Pedro, his absence a gaping wound none of us dared to acknowledge. Renata stared out the window, her camera clutched tightly in her lap as if it were the only thing tethering her to reality. Sophia sat next to me, trembling, her tear-streaked face buried in her hands. Even Mateus, usually quick with a sarcastic remark, had nothing to say. I couldn't stop replaying it in my mind. Pedro standing in that room, surrounded by the tapes, his voice steady as he ordered us to leave. The figure closing in on him, its distorted face filled with rage, the sound of the door slamming shut. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, trying to focus on the road ahead. But every now and then, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the sanatorium looming behind us. Or worse, Pedro's face staring back at me. "Do you think he—" Sophia's voice broke the silence, but she couldn't finish the question. "No," Renata said firmly, though her voice cracked. "Pedro didn't just die. He stopped it. He set us free." But her words felt more like an attempt to convince herself than us. When we finally reached the city, we went our separate ways, promising to regroup the next day to figure out what to do next. I barely slept that night, haunted by the whispers and the memory of Pedro's sacrifice. The next morning, I forced myself to watch the footage Renata had captured. At first, it was just what I expected. Eerie shots of the sanatorium's decaying halls, the faint sounds of whispers in the background. But then the screen flickered, and for a split second, I saw him. Pedro. He was standing in the circle, his face pale, his eyes hollow. His lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear, but his expression was clear. He was trapped. I shut the laptop, my hands trembling. A few days later, I found a cassette tape in the passenger seat of my car. I hadn't put it there, and neither had anyone else. The label was faded, the handwriting almost illegible, but I recognized it immediately. One of the tapes from the sanatorium. My heart pounded as I held it, debating whether to listen. Against my better judgment, I slid it into an old tape player and hit play. At first, it was just static. Then, Pedro's voice came through, clear and unmistakable. "You thought you escaped, but you didn't. None of us ever do." The tape cut off, leaving me in silence. I stared at the player, a cold dread seeping into my bones. Deep down, I knew he was right. The sanatorium hadn't let us go. It had simply let us believe we were free. The whispers returned that night, soft and distant at first, but growing louder with each passing hour. And now, as I sit here writing this, I can feel it, the weight of unseen eyes watching, waiting. The sanatorium doesn't just haunt its halls, it haunts us, forever.